Woodrow Wilson was the first president of the United States to visit Europe while in office, as he was deeply involved in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 near the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson getting the country involved in World War I begs the question, can he really be remembered as a champion of democracy abroad if he upheld segregation and racist policies at home? Remember that question, as it is key to his legacy and important to what we will be discussing in this video today. Before we go further, if you've been enjoying my US history content recently, please leave me a like and subscribe. If you've already done so, thank you. Now let's jump into it. Let's begin with the way Wilson became President of the United States. He cruised to the Democratic nomination in 1912. But as for the Republican side, sitting President William Howard Taft ran for re-election, but ex-President Theodore Roosevelt ran against him for the nomination. Taft was nominated barely, but Roosevelt was furious, so he and his supporters stormed out of the convention in rage. Roosevelt started the Bull Moose Party, and many Republicans voted for Roosevelt, splitting the party's vote between the two. 3 weeks prior to the election, Roosevelt was shot by John Trank while giving a speech in Milwaukee. The bullet hit the folded speech paper in his pocket as well as his eyeglass case, saving his life. 2 weeks later, and 6 days before the election, Taft's running mate and sitting vice president, James Sherman, died. The poor unity within the Republican Party and internal challenges of their campaigns allowed Wilson to cruise to the White House. But what did he do as Commander-in-Chief? Let's find out. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States, serving from 1913 to 1921. One of his biggest achievements was leading the country through World War I and helping shape the peace process afterwards. He pushed for the creation of the League of Nations, which was meant to keep peace in the world, though the U.S. never joined. At home, Wilson passed major progressive reforms, including the Federal Reserve Act, which helped stabilize the banking system. He also signed laws that limited child labor and improved working conditions for laborers. Wilson lowered tariffs and introduced a federal income tax through the 16th Amendment. Despite these successes, his presidency had major flaws. He supported segregation in the federal government and held racist beliefs that hurt African Americans. Wilson also faced criticisms for limiting free speech during the war through laws like the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Overall, Wilson's presidency was a mix of important reforms, global leadership, and deep contradictions. He initially attempted to keep the country out of war, as it was one of his major campaign promises when running for re-election in 1916. However, he ultimately entered the war, and the nation was divided on whether that was the right call, so he justified his decision, or at least tried to. Rapid intensification of the war meant governments had to be efficient in response to avoid disaster. Therefore, the War Industries Board and Food Administration were formed in an attempt to defend themselves in war efforts. Additionally, Wilson passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918 to silence anti-war opposition. The law limited free speech and led to arrests of activists worldwide. Finally, Wilson struggled to get U.S. Senate support for the Treaty of Versailles, and lack of support in Congress explains why the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. As for the domestic side, Wilson mightily struggled. His administration resegregated parts of the federal government, which angered African Americans and civil rights leaders. Wilson passed major reforms such as the aforementioned Federal Reserve Act and Clayton Antitrust Act. Still, he failed to support women's suffrage until very late in his presidency, but by that time, his wife Edith was basically president. We'll get into that later. In 1918, a global pandemic devastated the world, that being the Spanish flu, which hit the United States hard, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, and the Wilson administration struggled to respond in the midst of war. As for Wilson's personal health, he suffered a severe stroke in 1919, leaving him unable to properly discharge the duties of President of the United States, so his wife Edith took over much control of her husband's duties. This raised questions of who was really running the country. Before then, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations as part of his 14 points plan for world peace after World War I. He believed it would prevent future wars by encouraging diplomacy and cooperation among countries. However, the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, and America never joined, which weakened the League's power and global influence. Earlier in his presidency, in 1913, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve System to stabilize the economy and control inflation. It established a central bank, with regional branches to manage interest rates and money supply. This act became one of the most important parts of America's financial system and still plays a major role in 2025. One of the greatest criticisms towards Wilson was his support of segregation, and he allowed racist policies in federal offices. His administration rolled back progress for Black Americans and caused great harm to civil rights efforts. The climax of Wilson's presidency was signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This treaty officially ended World War I and placed harsh punishments on Germany, including taking away land, limiting its military, and demanding large payments. Wilson believed the treaty would bring peace, but many people thought it was too harsh and would lead to more conflict in the future. However, every nation with the exception of China ultimately signed the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson had spent months in Europe negotiating the terms. As mentioned, he was the first U.S. president to travel overseas while in office. His leadership at the peace talks showed that the United States had become a powerful nation with a strong voice in global decisions. However, Wilson faced strong opposition at home from people who believed the treaty gave too much power to other countries. He gave many speeches trying to convince Americans to support it, but his health began to fail. The Treaty of Versailles marked a turning point where America had to decide whether to stay involved in world affairs or return to isolation. Wilson never supported equal rights for women or for African Americans, harming his reputation in present day. Remember the question prompt from the beginning of this video? As a refresher, I asked, can Wilson truly be remembered as a champion of democracy abroad when he actively supported segregation and racist policies at home? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. I'd love to hear your deep intellectual insights. Prior to Wilson's presidency, Taft served 4 years in the White House before he and Roosevelt split the Republican Party vote. If you want to hear more about William Howard Taft, who did not get stuck in a bath, click in the top left corner, and if you want to subscribe to Beyond the Presidency, click in the top right corner.